There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the gentle weight of another person's sleep. You don't recognize them as pivotal until long after they've passed, when you're tracing the map of your own heart, and you find an X marking a spot you thought was just unremarkable terrain. For me, that moment smelled of old books and dried lavender, and it felt like the slow, rhythmic exhalation of a man I had loved in silence for 1,460 days. Julian was asleep on my chest, a dead weight of trust and unconscious vulnerability, and I was performing the painstaking art of not breathing, terrified that the slightest disturbance might shatter the fragile architecture of the instant. His head was tucked into the hollow of my shoulder, his arm slung loosely across my stomach, and the sound of his breathing was a current pulling me further out into a sea of profound and terrifying stillness. It was 3 in the morning. The city outside my third-floor apartment window had finally surrendered to a hushed, blue-black quiet, the usual cacophony of sirens and distant arguments muted by the late hour. A single street lamp cast a pale, amber rectangle onto the far wall, illuminating the spines of my photography books and the stoic, leafy silhouette of a fiddle-leaf figure. In that soft light, every detail felt amplified, sacred. I could feel the faint, fluttering pulse in Julian's temple where it rested against my collarbone. I could feel the warmth of his body seeping through my t-shirt, a radiating heat that seemed to be rearranging my own cellular structure, teaching my body a new language of comfort it had never known. This was the precipice. I knew it with a certainty that was both exhilarating and agonizing. For weeks, we had been orbiting this strange new gravity, drawn into a pattern of incidental closeness that felt anything but incidental. And now, here we were, at the silent, unmoving center of it all. My mind, a relentless cataloger of anxieties, was a maelstrom of unanswerable questions. What did this mean? Was this the casual, thoughtless intimacy of a friendship pushed to its limits by grief? Or was it the quiet, unspoken beginning of something else? Was I simply a port in his storm, a convenient and warm place to anchor himself while his own world was in turmoil? Or was it possible, just barely possible, that in this shared silence, he was hearing the same secret music that had been playing in my own chest for years? I held my breath, closed my eyes, and tried to commit the feeling of his weight against me to memory, developing it like a photograph in the darkroom of my mind, desperate to preserve it before the morning light came and exposed it for whatever it truly was. We had met in a downpour, a cliché so perfectly rendered it felt like a scene stolen from a film I'd never seen. It was April, and the sky had split open with a dramatic, theatrical violence that only a spring storm can muster. I was huddled under the faded green awning of a closed bookstore, my camera bag clutched to my chest like a vital organ, trying to calculate the odds of making a mad dash to the subway station without sacrificing my expensive equipment to the deluge. That's when he appeared, laughing as he sprinted for the same small patch of dry pavement. He was drenched, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his gray peacoat darkened to a near black by the rain. He shook his head like a dog, spraying a fine mist of water into the air, and then he turned to me, his smile a sudden, brilliant slash of light in the gloom of the afternoon. "Looks like we had the same idea," he'd said, his voice warm and easy, utterly unbothered by the storm. I, in my typical fashion, had probably just managed a tight, awkward nod. I was a man who lived behind a lens, more comfortable observing the world than participating in it, and his sudden, vibrant presence was like a flashbulb going off in my face. But Julian had a gift for dismantling defenses. He didn't seem to notice my reticence, or if he did, he didn't care. He just kept talking, filling the space between us with observations about the absurdity of the weather, a story about a meeting he'd just left, a complaint about his perpetually failing umbrella. He spoke with his hands, his face, his entire body, a kinetic storm of energy that stood in stark contrast to my own deliberate stillness. By the time the rain had softened to a manageable drizzle, I knew he was a consultant for a tech firm, that he traveled 3 weeks out of every 4, that he was perpetually losing his keys, and that he thought the bookstore we were sheltering under had the best collection of vintage science fiction in the city. He had learned almost nothing about me, other than my name, Liam, and the fact that I was a photographer. Yet, when he suggested we grab coffee once the rain stopped, it felt less like a question and more like a foregone conclusion. There was an inevitability to Julian, a gravitational pull that made resistance feel foolish. Our friendship unfurled from there, easily and naturally, like a vine finding its way toward the sun. He was the sun, and I was the quiet, shaded wall he grew against. We were a study in contrasts. He was a whirlwind of social engagements, tight deadlines, and cross-country flights. I was a creature of habit, my days dictated by the quiet ritual of my darkroom, the patient waiting for the right light, the solitary walks through the city searching for hidden moments of beauty. He filled my quiet apartment with noise and life, leaving a trail of coffee mugs and discarded jackets in his wake. I provided him with a quiet harbor, a place where the relentless demands of his world seemed to fade away. He would call me from airport lounges in cities I'd only seen in photographs, telling me about the frustrations of his latest project or the eccentricities of his clients. I would listen, offering little in the way of advice, but providing a steady, unwavering presence he seemed to need. He became my favorite subject, though he never knew it. I have a hard drive filled with hundreds of photos of him, most of them candid shots taken when he wasn't aware. Julian laughing at a bad joke I'd made, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Julian staring out my window, lost in thought, the late afternoon sun catching the gold flecks in his brown eyes. Julian asleep on my couch after a long flight, his usual kinetic energy finally stilled, looking younger and more vulnerable than the world ever got to see. The love I felt for him didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It was more like a slow-developing photograph, an image gradually emerging from the chemical bath of our shared time. At first, it was indistinct, a vague warmth, an admiration for his energy, a deep sense of comfort in his presence. Then, slowly, the lines began to sharpen, the details coming into focus. I remember the exact moment the image became clear. He had been telling me about a woman he was dating, Chloe, and he was describing their future as if it were a project plan. A house in the suburbs, 2 kids, a golden retriever. He spoke with a confident, detached optimism, but I was looking at him through my lens, metaphorically speaking, and what I saw was something else entirely. I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a hairline fracture in the confident facade. And in my own chest, I felt a sharp, unexpected ache. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was a profound, seismic recognition. It was the moment I understood that my affection for him had quietly, without my permission, deepened into a different ocean altogether, one with dangerous currents and uncharted depths. From that day forward, our friendship felt like a beautiful, fragile piece of glass. I was terrified of making a single wrong move, of letting the truth slip and watching the whole thing shatter. So I packed the feeling away, stored it in a dark, locked room in my heart, and continued to be the steady, reliable friend he needed. I became an expert in the art of loving from a safe distance, a master of the unspoken. The shift began on a Tuesday in October. It was a day of relentless, weeping rain, the kind that mirrored the gray melancholy of the city itself. Julian had been with Chloe for nearly 2 years, and from my vantage point, their relationship had seemed to be following the project plan he'd laid out. They had moved in together, adopted a ridiculously energetic rescue dog, and had begun the dreaded, endless search for a house just outside the city. Then, the entire structure imploded. I got a call from him late in the evening. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual warmth and energy. It was a voice I had never heard before. "Can I come over?" he'd asked. There was no preamble, no explanation. Just that raw, splintered question. "Of course," I said, my own heart starting to beat a little faster. "Are you okay?" A long silence stretched down the line, filled with a static that sounded like grief. "No," he finally said, the word barely a whisper. "Not really. When I opened my door 20 minutes later, he looked like a ghost. He was pale, his eyes red-rimmed and vacant. He carried a single duffel bag, which he dropped by the door as if it weighed 100 pounds. He didn't speak. He just walked past me into the living room and sank onto my sofa, staring at the blank television screen as if it held the answers to some cosmic riddle. I didn't press him for details. I just made him a cup of tea, the way my mother used to for me when I was sick, and placed it on the coffee table in front of him. He didn't touch it. We sat there in silence for what felt like an hour, the only sounds the ticking of the clock on the wall and the steady drumming of the rain against the window panes. He was a statue of misery, and I was his silent, helpless witness. Eventually, the story came out in broken fragments. It wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a slow erosion. He had realized, he said, that he was performing a life rather than living one. He was checking off boxes, hitting milestones, building a future he was supposed to want, but his heart wasn't in it. Chloe, he said, deserved someone who wasn't just going through the motions. The breakup had been quiet, civilized, and utterly devastating for them both. He had packed a bag and left, with no idea where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay there, in the home they had built together, which now felt like a museum of their shared failure. He had ended up at my door because, he said, it was the only place he could think of where he didn't have to pretend. That admission, more than anything else, cracked something open in my chest. To be his one safe harbor, it was a role I had always quietly occupied, but to hear him say it aloud gave it a new and terrifying weight. He stayed on the couch that night, and the next, and the night after that. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of solitude, reconfigured itself around his presence. His duffel bag remained by the door, a silent testament to his displacement. I would wake up in the morning to find him already awake, staring out the window with that same hollow expression. We fell into a strange, unspoken routine. I would work in my studio, the door left open, and he would drift in and out, sometimes watching me edit photos for hours without saying a word, other times just sitting in the worn armchair in the corner, a book open on his lap, though I never saw him turn a page. He was present in body, but his spirit seemed to be miles away, lost in the wreckage of his former life. I tried to give him space, to be a source of quiet stability without being intrusive. I cooked meals I knew he liked. I kept the apartment tidy and calm. I curated a space of profound and deliberate peace, hoping some of it might seep into him. I was his keeper, the lighthouse keeper on the rocky shore of his grief, and I did not yet understand that the tides were about to change, pulling us both into a new and uncharted territory. The architecture of our friendship, once so clearly defined, was beginning to dissolve, its walls becoming permeable, its rooms bleeding into one another. The ritual began, as most significant things do, in a small and unassuming way. It was about 2 weeks into his self-imposed exile at my apartment. He was starting to look less like a ghost and more like a person again. The color was returning to his face, and the hollows under his eyes were less pronounced. We were on the couch, watching some mindless action movie I'd put on as a form of auditory wallpaper, a noise to fill the silence that had grown heavy between us. It was late, and a chill had crept into the room. I had an old, thick wool blanket draped over my legs. Julian, who was sitting at the other end of the couch, a carefully maintained foot of space between us, shivered. It was a small, almost imperceptible tremor, but in the hypervigilant state I now permanently occupied around him, I noticed it immediately. "You cold?" I asked, my voice quiet. He nodded, his eyes still on the screen. "A little. This old building doesn't hold heat well." Without thinking, I unfolded the blanket and stretched it across the length of the sofa, so that it covered him too. It was a simple, platonic gesture, a friend offering warmth to another friend. But the moment the wool settled over his legs, the air in the room shifted. The space between us, once in neutral territory, was now charged with a new significance. We were connected by this single, shared covering. I could feel the slight vibrations through the fabric whenever he shifted his weight. My entire awareness contracted to that single point of contact, that shared landscape of wool. I tried to focus on the movie, on the predictable explosions and cheesy dialogue, but it was impossible. My mind was consumed by the cartography of the couch, mapping the distance between my thigh and his, the inches that felt like miles, the shared warmth that felt like a secret. A few nights later, the boundary shifted again. We were in the same positions, under the same blanket. This time, he was the one who moved. He sighed, a sound of deep, bone-weary exhaustion, and then he shifted, turning on his side to face me and drawing his legs up. In the process, his knee brushed against my thigh. He didn't pull away. He let it rest there. It was a small, incidental point of contact, one that could easily be explained away. The couch wasn't that big. He was just getting comfortable. Plausible deniability. It became Julian's signature move. But my body didn't understand plausible deniability. My body only understood the searing, electric heat of that casual touch. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I was certain he could hear it. I was certain the entire room was vibrating with the force of my unspoken, terrifying hope. From there, the ritual escalated with a slow, deliberate grace. The foot of space between us on the couch dwindled to inches, and then to nothing at all. Our movie nights became a silent agreement. We would start at opposite ends of the sofa, and by the first commercial break, we would have drifted toward the center, our shoulders and hips pressed together, the blanket a shared skin. Then came the next evolution. One night, he fell asleep. His head, which had been propped against the armrest, slumped sideways until it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I sat there for over an hour, my muscles screaming in protest, my neck stiffening, not daring to move a muscle for fear of waking him. He looked so peaceful, the lines of stress and grief that had been etched around his eyes and mouth finally smoothed away in sleep. In that moment, I felt a wave of tenderness so powerful it almost brought me to tears. I was his anchor, his safe place. And if this was all I could ever be for him, I decided in that quiet, aching moment, it would have to be enough. But it wasn't all. The next time he fell asleep against me, I found the courage to relax. I let my own head rest against his, the faint scent of his shampoo, something clean, like sandalwood and bergamot, filling my senses. It became our new normal. We no longer bothered with the pretense of starting at opposite ends of the couch. He would sit down and immediately lean against me, fitting himself into the curve of my side as if it were a space designed just for him. He would often take my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a gesture performed with the same casual, sleepy intimacy with which he did everything else. I never knew if he was even aware he was doing it. Perhaps it was an unconscious act, a simple seeking of comfort. Or perhaps it was a deliberate test, a question he was asking without words. I lived in the unbearable, beautiful tension of that ambiguity. My life became a series of these quiet, domestic tableaus, each one a photograph I would mentally capture and store away. Julian, his feet tucked under my legs, reading a book while I sketched in my notebook. Julian, tracing idle patterns on the back of my hand while we listened to music. Julian, his breath warm against my neck, murmuring something in his sleep. His duffel bag by the door remained unpacked. He had his own apartment, a perfectly good space across town that he was still paying rent on. He had clothes there, his own bed, the remnants of his old life. But he chose to be here, in my small, quiet world, sleeping on my lumpy sofa. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night and find him standing in the hallway, caught between the living room and the guest room I had offered him a dozen times. The door to the guest room was always open, a silent invitation he never accepted. He would just stand there, a silhouette in the dim light from the street, and then, inevitably, he would turn and go back to the couch. That open door became a powerful symbol for me. It was a threshold he was unwilling to cross. He wouldn't retreat fully back into his own life, but he wouldn't fully enter mine, either. He was living in the liminal space, the hallway between two rooms, and he had pulled me in there with him. My anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my newfound contentment. Every moment of this fragile intimacy felt borrowed. I was terrified that one morning he would wake up, the fog of his grief would have lifted, and he would see our arrangement for what it was: strange, undefined, and unsustainable. He would realize he was leaning on me too heavily, that the lines had become irrevocably blurred. He would thank me for my help, pack his duffel bag, and walk out the door, leaving me in a silence that would be 1,000 times more profound and empty than the solitude I had known before. This fear made me a coward. I never questioned him. I never asked what we were doing. I never gave voice to the question that was screaming in my mind every time he rested his head on my shoulder. What does this mean? I just accepted the comfort he offered, hoarding these moments of closeness like a dragon hoarding gold, living in a state of suspended disbelief. It was a beautiful, agonizing purgatory, and I was terrified of doing anything that might cause my expulsion from it. We existed in this state of suspended animation for nearly a month. The ritual was as ingrained in our daily lives as making coffee in the morning. He would come home from the consulting work he had slowly started to take on again, his shoulders tight with the stress of the day. We would eat dinner, sometimes talking, sometimes in a comfortable silence. And then we would migrate to the couch, to our spot, and he would fold himself against me, and I would feel the tension slowly seep out of him. I became a barometer for his emotional state. I could feel the frantic energy of a bad day in the way his leg would jiggle restlessly against mine. I could feel the deep weariness of a long week in the way he would sink into me, his sigh a complete surrender. I learned the topography of his body, the exact spot behind his ear that was sensitive to a light touch, the way his fingers would twitch just before he fell into a deep sleep. I knew him in this physical, intimate way that felt more profound than any conversation. And yet, we never spoke of it. It was a silent pact, a world we had built for two, with its own rules and its own language, a language composed entirely of touch and proximity. It was a fragile ecosystem, and I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it couldn't last forever. Something had to break. The tension had to be released. I just prayed that when it did, it wouldn't break me with it. The night it happened, the air was different. A storm was brewing outside, the same kind of dramatic, electric storm that had presided over our first meeting. The wind rattled the window frames, and the sky was a bruised, purple-gray. Inside, the silence in my apartment felt heavier, denser than usual. We were on the couch, in our usual configuration. Julian was tucked against my side, my arm draped around his shoulders, his hand resting on my stomach. The television was on, but the sound was muted. We were just watching the flashes of lightning illuminate the sky, counting the seconds until the thunder followed, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the floorboards. He had been quiet all evening, a thoughtful, introspective quiet that was different from his usual tired silence. I could feel him thinking, the subtle energy of his mind at work. He shifted, pulling back just enough to look at me. The light from a distant lightning strike flashed across his face, casting his features in a stark, momentary relief. His eyes, which were usually so full of warmth and easy laughter, were serious, searching. He looked at me for a long moment, and in his gaze, I saw a universe of unspoken things, confusion, fear, and something else, something tender and hesitant that made my breath catch in my throat. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the wind and the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. Liam. His voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the rumble of another wave of thunder. I couldn't find my own voice. I just looked at him, trying to keep my expression neutral, trying not to betray the wild hope that was surging through me. I gave a small nod, a barely perceptible motion. He continued to search my face, his expression vulnerable, open. Is this okay?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last word. His gaze flickered down to his hand on my stomach, to the way our bodies were pressed together. He was finally acknowledging it. He was naming the thing we had so carefully, so deliberately, left unnamed. He was giving me an out. He was giving me a chance to say no, to re-establish the boundaries, to retreat to the safety of our old friendship. And in that moment, all my fear, all my anxiety, all my carefully constructed defenses, they all just evaporated. The cowardice that had kept me silent for so long was replaced by a sudden, stunning clarity. I was done living in the hallway. I was done with ambiguity. Whatever happened next, I wanted it to be real. Yes, I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I expected it to be. It's okay. Relief washed over his features, a visible softening of the tension around his eyes and mouth. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time. He didn't move away. If anything, he leaned in slightly closer, the space between us shrinking until it was almost non-existent. We stayed like that, suspended in the charged air, our eyes locked. The storm outside seemed to be building to a crescendo, mirroring the tempest inside my own chest. The world had contracted to this single point, this small space on my worn-out sofa, this man whose presence had completely rewired my universe. Then, he broke the silence again, his voice even quieter than before, so soft I had to strain to hear it over the storm. It was a question that I think, on some level, I had been waiting to hear for 4 years. It was a question that held the power to either save me or destroy me completely. Would it be okay, he began, his gaze unwavering, if I kissed you? Time stopped. The thunder, the rain, the city, it all faded away into a distant hum. There was only his face, inches from mine, his eyes wide with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. He was asking for permission. He wasn't assuming, he wasn't taking. He was asking. He was laying his own heart bare, giving me all the power. And in his question, I heard the echo of all my own unspoken yearning, all my secret hopes. This wasn't a moment of confusion or grief-fueled desperation. This was a choice. This was real. I didn't trust myself to speak. My throat was tight with 1,000 emotions that were all trying to escape at once. So I just nodded. A slow, deliberate, unequivocal nod. Yes. He closed his eyes, a flicker of something that looked like relief or gratitude passing over his face. And then he leaned forward, closing the final inch between us. His lips met mine with a gentleness that undid me. It wasn't a passionate, demanding kiss like the ones in the movies we'd been pretending to watch. It was tentative, soft, a question. It was a confession. It was the taste of rain and salt and a quiet, desperate hope. His hand moved from my stomach to my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek with an impossible tenderness. I brought my own hand up to the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in his soft hair, pulling him just slightly closer. It felt like coming home. It felt like every scattered, broken piece of me was finally clicking into place. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its sense of reverence, its quiet awe. It was a conversation we had been waiting our whole lives to have, and it was happening now, without a single word, in the flickering, storm-lit darkness of my living room. We were no longer on the edge of the cliff. We had jumped, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the fall. The morning after was a landscape of brittle silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean, the air crisp and clear. But inside my apartment, a different kind of storm had settled, a quiet, unnerving one. I woke up on the couch, alone. A cool draft was coming from the space where Julian's body had been. The wool blanket was neatly folded on the armrest. For a moment, a disorienting panic seized me. Had I dreamed it? Had the storm and my own desperate yearning conspired to create a perfect, heartbreaking hallucination? Then I saw his coffee mug, half full, on the kitchen counter. He was here. He was real. The kiss had been real. I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window, his back to me. He was fully dressed, not in the comfortable clothes he usually wore around the apartment, but in the crisp shirt and trousers he wore for work. His shoulders were rigid, a wall of tense muscle. The easy, relaxed posture I had grown so accustomed to was gone, replaced by a defensive guardedness. He didn't turn when I entered the room. He must have heard me, but he gave no sign. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of the intimacy we had shared just hours before. "Hey," I said, my voice rough with sleep. He finally turned, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "Hey," he mumbled, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I have an early meeting I forgot about. I should get going." It was a lie. A clumsy, Transparent lie. Julian was meticulously organized. He never forgot meetings. My heart, which had been soaring just hours ago, began a slow, painful descent. I watched as he grabbed his messenger bag from the chair, his movements jerky and efficient. He was building a wall between us, brick by painful brick. He was retreating, running for cover. Julian. I started, taking a step toward him. He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. He took a step back, widening the chasm that was opening up between us. "I'll call you later," he said, already moving toward the door. He grabbed his pea coat, and then, for the first time, he paused. He looked at the duffel bag that had been sitting by my door for a month, a silent fixture in our shared life. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned, and without another word, he opened the door and walked out, closing it softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silent apartment like a gunshot. He didn't call. Not later that day, not the next. My text messages, at first casual and then increasingly anxious, were met with short, sterile replies hours later. Busy day, in meetings, talk soon, each one was a small, sharp blow. The vibrant, intimate world we had built on my sofa had vanished, replaced by this cold, empty space. The apartment felt cavernous without him, the silence no longer peaceful but oppressive. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, the memory of his touch, his warmth, his presence, clinging to every surface. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I been wrong? Had I misinterpreted everything? Was I just a convenient, warm body for a man reeling from a breakup, a temporary solace he now regretted? The thought was a physical pain, a twisting in my gut. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest was now a withered, ugly thing. After 3 days of this agonizing silence, something inside me broke. I couldn't live in this new, torturous ambiguity. The old ambiguity had been a place of quiet hope. This was a place of active pain. I deserved more than this. We deserved more than this. Whatever we were, whatever we had been, it deserved the dignity of an honest conversation. My fear of losing him was finally eclipsed by the terror of living like this, of letting our beautiful, complicated connection die a slow, silent death. I put on my jacket, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and fear, and I walked out of my apartment. I was going to his place. I was going to get an answer. The open door in my hallway had been slammed shut, and I was going to find out why. His apartment was on the other side of town, in a modern, impersonal building that felt nothing like him. It was the apartment he had shared with Chloe, a fact that settled like a stone in my stomach. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my heart pounding against my ribs, my courage threatening to desert me. I almost turned around a dozen times. But then I thought of the way he had looked at me just before he'd kissed me, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. That was real. I had to believe that was real. I took a deep breath and knocked. The silence on the other side of the door was absolute. I knocked again, harder this time. "Julian, I know you're in there. We need to talk." More silence. I could feel a hot, frustrated anger starting to bubble up inside me. "Damn it, Julian, don't do this. Don't just disappear. You don't get to do that. Not after everything. Open the door." I heard a faint shuffling from inside, and then the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a crack, and he was standing there, looking even worse than he had the day he first showed up at my apartment. He was unshaven, his hair was a mess, and he was wearing the same shirt he'd had on 3 days ago. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. He didn't open the door any wider. He just stood there, blocking the entrance, a sentinel guarding his own self-imposed prison. "Liam," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "Now's not a good time, no," I said, my voice firm, surprising myself with its strength. "We're not doing that. I'm not leaving until you talk to me. What happened? What is this?" He finally looked at me then, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it stole my breath. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't do this." "You can't do what?" I pressed, my voice rising. "You can't talk to me? You can't kiss me? You can't just show up and dismantle my entire life, and then run away when it gets real. What did you think was going to happen? I don't know, he exclaimed, his voice cracking with a desperate frustration that mirrored my own. He ran a hand through his hair, his whole body thrumming with a nervous, agitated energy. I don't know, Liam. I didn't think. I felt. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He finally stepped back, pulling the door open in a gesture of weary surrender. I walked into the apartment. It was sterile and impersonal, full of stylish, minimalist furniture that screamed Chloe's taste. The only sign of Julian was a pile of takeout containers on the coffee table and a rumpled blanket on the couch. He hadn't even been sleeping in his own bed. He had been recreating our ritual, alone. The thought was both pathetic and heartbreaking. He wouldn't look at me. He just paced the length of the living room, a caged animal. I stood by the door, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I had to be the one to break it. I thought it was real, I said, my voice quiet but clear in the still room. The way you looked at me. The kiss. I thought it meant something. Was I wrong? Was I just a mistake? A rebound? Because if I was, you need to tell me. I can take it. But what I can't take is this silence. This ghosting. You are my best friend, Julian. Before all of this, you were my best friend. And you're treating me like a stranger. That finally made him stop pacing. He stood in the middle of the room, his back to me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. You're not a mistake, he said, so quietly I could barely hear him. That's the problem. It was the realest thing I've felt in years. And it terrified me. He turned to face me, and his carefully constructed walls had finally crumbled. His face was a mask of confusion and fear and a deep, aching sadness. I've spent my whole life following a map, Liam. A map that other people drew for me. Go to college, get a good job, meet a nice girl, buy a house. I was doing it. I was on the right path. And it was making me miserable, but it was the only path I knew. And then there was you. You were never on the map. You were this quiet, beautiful, uncharted territory. He took a shaky breath, his eyes pleading with me to understand. Being with you, on your couch, it was the only place I felt like myself. Not the consultant, not Chloe's boyfriend, just Julian. And I didn't understand it. I didn't let myself understand it. I just knew I needed it. I needed you. And then I kissed you, and everything came into focus. It was like I had been living my whole life in black and white, and suddenly everything was in color. And I panicked, because that kiss, it meant I had to throw away the map. It meant admitting that my entire life, everything I thought I wanted, was wrong. It meant that the thing I actually want, the person I actually want, is my best friend. And I don't know how to be that person, Liam. I don't know what to do with that feeling. It's too big. And I was so afraid I would break it. That I would break you. That I would ruin the one good, pure thing in my life. So I ran. It's what I do. I run. His confession hung in the air between us, a raw and honest and beautiful thing. All my anger, all my hurt, it just dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that his life could be something other than what he had been told it should be. I closed the distance between us, slowly, giving him time to retreat if he wanted to. He didn't move. I stopped in front of him, so close I could see the frantic pulse beating in his throat. I reached out and gently took his hand. His fingers were ice cold. You don't have to know how to be that person, I said softly. We can figure it out together. You don't have to have a map. We can just walk, see where the path goes. As long as we're on it together, I squeezed his hand. Please don't run from me again, Julian. I think I've been waiting for you on this path for a very long time. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just looked at me, a glimmer of hope finally breaking through the fear in his eyes. He laced his fingers through mine, his grip tight, desperate. Okay, he whispered. Okay, Liam. No more running. And in the sterile, unfamiliar landscape of his old life, surrounded by the ghosts of a future that was never meant to be, we began to draw a new map. One that had no destination, no milestones, no pre-drawn lines. It had only a starting point. and it was us. The conversation that followed was the longest and most important of our lives. We sat on that unfamiliar couch, a world away from the comfort of mine, and we talked for hours. We dismantled the past, examined the present, and cautiously, tentatively, began to build a framework for the future. He told me about the creeping sense of dislocation he'd felt in his life with Chloe, the feeling of being an actor playing a role he'd forgotten the motivation for. He spoke of the profound loneliness that had been his constant companion on all those business trips, a loneliness that had only ever been assuaged by our late-night phone calls. I, in turn, confessed the depth and breadth of my own feelings for him. I told him about the photograph, the moment I knew my heart had betrayed the comfortable confines of our friendship. I told him about the years of quiet ache, of watching him build a life with someone else while I silently wished it were me. I laid my own vulnerability at his feet, a matching offering to his own. There were no more secrets, no more ambiguities. The space between us was finally filled with the beautiful, terrifying, and liberating truth. It was a foundation, solid and real, on which we could finally begin to build. That night, he packed his duffel bag. But this time, it was different. He wasn't packing to leave me. He was packing to finally, truly, arrive. He packed his clothes, a few books, his laptop. He left behind the life that had never really been his. We walked out of that apartment together, and he didn't look back. When we got back to my place, the first thing he did was walk over to the guest room, the room he had never entered, and he decisively closed the door. It was a symbolic act, a closing of the chapter on his life in the hallway. There were no more liminal spaces. There was only here. Our new normal was a thing of quiet, deliberate beauty. It was built not on grand romantic gestures, but on a series of small, intentional acts of care. It was in the way he started making the coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I would bring him a blanket when he was working late at the kitchen table, draping it over his shoulders without a word. The nervous, uncertain energy that had crackled between us was replaced by a deep, settled peace. The tentative, questioning touches were replaced by a confident, easy intimacy. He would reach for my hand when we walked down the street, his fingers lacing through mine with a sense of rightness that was breathtaking. He would kiss me goodbye in the morning, a real kiss, full of warmth and promise, not the chaste, uncertain thing it had once been. The couch was still our place, but its meaning had transformed. It was no longer a landscape of agonizing ambiguity, but a harbor of established comfort. We would still curl up together at the end of the day, but now there was no pretense. His head would find its familiar place on my shoulder, my arm would go around him, and it was simply us. It was our shape, but more often than not, we ended the night in my bed. The first time he slept there, it felt like a quiet revolution. To lie next to him, to feel the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me in the darkness, to know that this wasn't a temporary arrangement or a byproduct of grief, but a conscious choice. It was a feeling of peace so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. I would lie awake for hours, just as I had that first night on the couch, but the frantic, anxious questions in my mind were gone. They were replaced by a single, simple, overwhelming feeling, gratitude. He began to bring his life into my home, piece by piece. A box of his favorite books appeared on my shelves, their spines mingling with my own. His ridiculously oversized winter coat hung next to my jacket by the door. His presence was no longer a temporary disruption, but a permanent, welcome layer of my own existence. My solitary sanctuary had become our shared home, and in doing so, it had become more of a sanctuary than it had ever been when I was alone. He filled the quiet spaces not with noise, but with a comforting, resonant presence. And I, who had always guarded my solitude so fiercely, found that I had never truly been lonely until I understood what it was to not be. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. His wounds from his past life, and my wounds from years of unspoken love, were slowly, carefully tended to in the gentle domesticity of our new reality. There were still moments of fear, of uncertainty. We were navigating a new world without a map, after all. Sometimes I would see a flicker of the old panic in his eyes, the fear that he was unequal to the task of this new, uncharted life. And in those moments, I would simply take his hand, a silent reminder that he wasn't walking the path alone. He was no longer just the unknowing initiator, and I was no longer just the quiet observer. We were partners, co-authors of a new story, discovering the plot one day at a time. The ordinary moments, the ones that had once been so fraught with tension and meaning, were now simply life. They were the quiet, sturdy bricks with which we were building our future. And it was a future that felt more real, more honest, and more full of hope than any pre-drawn map could ever have promised. It was a future we were finding, right here, in the beautiful, honest space we had finally learned to create together.